He asked the economy to grow. President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, he specifically instructed that it must grow at the meeting of the Council for Strategic Development. Can the national economy grow by magic, or just because I want it to? Or was that just stand-up comedy already?
Of course, it's stand-up, absolutely, you're right. He's actually quite good at it. A pretty talented stand-up comedian, no question. I can't say anything about that. He lies fantastically, beautifully, convincingly. And as I understand it, many people in Russia believe him. It's a talent. You know, con artists have a remarkable talent for inspiring trust. It's a special skill and ability. So in that sense, he's a very talented person. I won't argue with that. But of course, there won't be any growth. The only remaining question for us is exactly how deep and significant the decline will be. There's no growth. Growth is a highly complex and multifaceted matter. We economists have studied this specific topic very thoroughly, and it's clear that growth is quite a remarkable phenomenon. It's complex. You need to bring together quite a few factors for something to start happening. Sometimes it's a rather random phenomenon, I would even put it that way. You can try really hard, but there still won't be any growth. No matter how much you try or push yourself, there just isn't any growth because something isn't working out. And in the Russian economy, it's not possible to bring together the factors for growth and create a mechanism for growth. Just so you understand, actually, in the history of 20th century Russia, there are two periods of stagnation. The first one is the Brezhnev stagnation, right? About 8 years. There's also the Putin stagnation, which has already lasted for about 10 years, maybe even longer. So the Putin stagnation has already lasted longer than the Brezhnev one. Let me explain what stagnation means under Putin. You can take a comprehensive look at the growth of Russia's gross domestic product, say, over the last 10 years. There were various fluctuating economic periods, but 10 years is a significantly substantial period of time. The average growth rate is 1.7%, barely scraping by. It's what you might call a feeble body. So that's why Russia's economy is already pretty weak. Its growth, it can't manage because a lot of things are missing, a lot has been lost. And even this 1.7% was achieved with fairly high oil prices. That is, revenues were coming in and they could be spent on something, used to buy things or invested. And now Russia has also been left without oil revenues. And here the question isn't whether there will be growth as Putin demands, but rather how deep the decline will be. And no government will be able to do anything about it. Of course, they'll pass yet another bogus document. It will be very funny. The other day, I was amusing myself by analyzing a Russian government document. Honestly, I swear, I was just having fun, really. The document is quite serious. Oh my dear mother, it's signed by the official Russian government, specifically by Mikhail Mishustin's own administration. This is the comprehensive and highly detailed budget forecast for the entire Russian Federation all the way up to the year 2042. Everything possible is hidden and tucked away in there. But I dug it up, figured it out. I was absolutely amazed. In this forecast, even before Putin said anything, they've already set the growth rates up to 2042. On average, in the worst case scenario, 6.7%. And in the best case scenario for Russia, 7.4%. That's pure fantasy. It's a complete sham, total nonsense. But it's been set and approved. It's just beautiful, really.
Yeah, it reminded me of a fairy tale come to life. I can just imagine how you'll open it up.
Oh, Danla, speaking of fairy tales, I always remember this wonderful story where the Czar hired Baba Yaga to harm the main character, but she couldn't do it. He calls her and says, "Why didn't you do it, old woman?" She replies, "I just couldn't." She says, "Master, I just couldn't."
Well, I just could not do it. I simply just could not.
So the Russian government today is basically saying, "Well, master, I just couldn't, I just couldn't." There was no growth, only a decline happened. That's pretty much the story here.
Look, even Deripaska is talking about the threat of thousands of enterprises going bankrupt. So basically, in some way or another, it's already starting to show through. Literally, right before our conversation, I was reading an article from RBC Ukraine, from the Institute for the Study of War. They have a whole article about how Russia needs to be, if we put the country under significant and sustained economic pressure, then perhaps Putin will eventually make some meaningful concessions. So just how bad is the current economic and political situation, and how much worse could it potentially get in the coming months? What will this lead to? Any attempts at least to negotiate instead of continuing to destroy everything further?
Well, look, Talov, my position has always been the same, and I always explain it, and I won't back down from it. No amount of economic pressure will force Putin to stop the war because what drives him is a personal fear for his own life. As long as he's at the head of a country at war, he personally is safe. He absolutely doesn't care what happens to Russia. He is destroying and ruining it, and he couldn't care less. As long as he maintains his power, he will keep trying to wage war. But there's another logic. The country itself could simply fall apart under him. This is the topic where I constantly argue with people who say that Russia cannot fall apart. And I, having lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union and having observed it all quite closely, and from the inside, I fully understand that it can fall apart because when the money runs out, the loyalty of the elites runs out too. Well, elite is a loaded word. Russians often critique my use of the word elites. They say elite implies something select or special. What selectiveness is there in Russia? It's just our riffraff everywhere. The country is what it is, so is the elite. Well, okay, but I use the word elite in a political sense. That is, it means the governing stratum of the nation. That's the only way I understand it. This governing stratum, its loyalty is held together only by money. No, there is absolutely no ideology and no sense of patriotism. It's all nonsense, it's all fake. None of that works in Russia. But as long as the state gives out money and that money can be stolen for personal gain, loyalty exists. Well, the issue is that the state is running out of money to be stolen. You know, in the past it was clear some projects would be launched, national programs, funding would be allocated, and you'd immediately start actively stealing from it. And basically, well, how should I put it? I can certainly name a somewhat ridiculous figure, but it is empirical, even though it is roughly accurate. How much budget money is stolen in Russia every year?
Okay.
Even back in the earlier historical period. About 10 to 15 years ago, the figure was around 30% of the total budget being stolen.
Exactly half
Budget goes into the pockets.
of these elites.
Yes, it's very funny. Let me even tell you where this figure comes from. It's really funny. There was a deputy prime minister named Dvorkovich, maybe you even remember him. Well, he was quite young, one of the technocrats, but very charming, young. Very young for the government of the Russian Federation.
We had our people back then.
Well, anyway, so to speak, he was once invited to speak at the financial university in front of students, and there were a lot of beautiful young students there. A lot.
Well,
He was naturally incredibly inspired. Well, you know, a girl wants to be looked at with admiration. You're like a saint, you see. And so, with a wave of his hand, he blurted out, saying, "Every year we sum up the results of the budget execution, and 30% of the budget just disappears somewhere. No one knows where. They aren't invested in anything, not spent on anything, they just disappeared. We can't figure it out. But apparently, that's just the natural standard. Shrinkage, wastage of budget funds, 30%. That's how it used to be. Now, the norm is probably even higher. But now there's nothing left to steal, because the budget doesn't provide any money. It cuts all spending on the economy because the money is going to the war. And it turns out that, of course, you're very loyal to President Putin, but there's nothing left to steal. Well, that's just utter misery. Why even be loyal? So the situation is such that it's more likely Russia will collapse as a state. And then it will stop fighting, but that's what happened with the Soviet Union. It strained itself for a long time. If you remember, it even tried to participate in the Star Wars arms race in space, which was imposed by Reagan. But it overexerted itself, collapsed, ended up a bankrupt country, and that was the end of it.
By the way, now even the entire Russian space program has shut down. Something broke and they can't fix it. His sanctions, well, there's no money. Yes, that's how it is.
Yes, that's how it is. The only launch platform they had for sending people into space broke down. Now, I don't know how they're going to fix it. I really don't know. Well, everything has fallen apart. What kind of growth can there be when Russia has ceased to be a scientific and technological power? This has always been a country that prided itself on its outstanding physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology. It's all been destroyed, everything is lost. People have left, funding has stopped. In Russia now, well, people get mad at me again when I say this. You come to Russia, we have lots of smart minds, maybe even a lot, but they're not allowed to work. And they leave. And if you look at the statistics, even the official ones, in Russia now, the number of scientific and technical workers who are actually working in scientific institutions is 3 times less than it was in 1990 in the Russian Federation. 3 times less. And most of them are fairly elderly people. Well, from my youthful age or a bit younger.
The situation in Iran, you mentioned it. Does it have any impact on Russia's economy, on its military capabilities? We already know about the Iranian Shaheds, that they were officially supplied to Russia. Is it possible that these supplies will stop and so on? Will the situation in Iran affect Russia in any way? I don't know if people will take this as an example, but that's more of a rhetorical question. I even think there's no point in discussing it because, well, I don't know, maybe you have a different opinion.
Well, look, the situation in Iran is fraught with consequences, right?
So,
If the revolution that's practically happening there right now is ultimately successful, I think it will be a tremendous source of joy for humanity. And if a new administration comes to power, it will be very friendly and cooperative to the USA. Well, as you know, Trump just recently received the head of Libya at the White House. So basically, that would be a completely different story. If that happens, Iran will return to the global oil market and to the global gas market, by the way. Let me remind you that Iran is extremely rich not only in oil but also in gas. All of that is currently in poor condition there, quite ruined. And in general, Iran is now experiencing a severe energy crisis, if you look into it. But if this religious regime is overthrown, then a revival could begin there, with help from the Americans and possibly from Israel. And then we would see a rather quick and active return of Iran to the oil market. There will be even more oil supply, even lower prices, and the $69 that the Russian government is so fondly hoping for simply won't exist. The challenge will be to keep it at 50, and that's the 50 that the Americans want and what Trump is talking about. This is the price. WTI crude is American oil. It's a bit cheaper than Brent, but significantly more expensive than euros. So if it's 50 for WTI, then for Russia it will be at best around 40. And in Russia, the oil production costs are $40 to $47 per barrel. In other words, the Russian oil industry will mostly become unprofitable and will require subsidies from the budget. But subsidies can't be provided because there won't be any income from the oil sector to subsidize the oil sector.
I remember now how we talked about this, and you basically predicted it. But back then, it really seemed unrealistic. I remember that on the broadcasts of Freedom, the Freedom TV channel, for example, we talked about $59 per barrel, or things like, well, I don't know, that's impossible, blah, blah, blah. Now we're talking about just below $40. And this is reality. So, what I want to say to our viewers right now is, if all of this seems surreal and unreal to you, it's just your impression. Look, it turns out that Russia is surrounded on all sides. Well, in a collapse, the regime falls, and that's Venezuela before Maduro was arrested by China. It's not as interesting anymore. It's like a cow that's already, well, yes, exhausted and doesn't give as much milk as one would like. And Ukraine still refuses to give in. It's sitting there without electricity, heat, or water, and still won't make any concessions, won't give up anything, and keeps fighting. Consequently, it has become increasingly clear that this is already a kind of final death throes, the comprehensive and systematic destruction of Ukraine's vital energy and utility infrastructure. It's like a mean bully who's already throwing whatever stones he has left, just to finish it all off.
Well, I always quote a saying that I think is very true. A father didn't beat his son for playing, but for trying to get even. That's a very accurate saying. That's exactly what Russia is doing, trying to get even. It got itself into a war it simply can't win. This is an incredible problem for them. In fact, they've already been fighting this war longer than the Great Patriotic War lasted. And it's quite amusing how these Russian pro-government public pages are now complaining, saying that during the Great Patriotic War, they reached Berlin in 4 years. They took Berlin, but here, after 4 years, they still can't fully capture Kupiansk. So much for Russia's great army. It's funny. It's funny and shameful, but Putin is just trying to get even. But the way he's getting even is truly terrifying. Russia probably doesn't even really understand this. Right now, he's flushing away Russia's entire future. And that means that even if the war ends, Russia will hardly be able to recover in any normal way. It has lost too much. It has squandered too much. It has destroyed too much and created enormous problems. I always say, let's imagine a simple situation. Well, let's say Russia wins the war, let's say along the current front line. It holds on to these territories that it has occupied, but then those territories need to be rebuilt. That will require pouring in an absolutely enormous amount of money. I tried to calculate it, and it turns out you would need to invest 15 to 20 trillion just to make it possible to live there somehow. Russia doesn't have that kind of money at all. So it has saddled itself with a terrible burden, this new one. Meanwhile, the old territory of Russia is even more devastated and no one knows what to do about it. And Russia is slashing social programs on the fly. Recently, a deputy named Gurulyov made a statement. He exists, yes, an outstanding political figure in Russia, and he said, "Guys, we promised you a program to relocate people from unsafe housing. Forget it, there's no money, all the money is going to the war. Just live and pray that your house doesn't collapse on you. If you pray, you'll be fine and the house won't fall down. When the war is over, maybe we'll relocate you. So keep living in these old houses that are suspiciously creaking above your heads, and to keep them from collapsing, pray harder day and night. Maybe then you'll survive." So that's exactly it. Utilities aren't being repaired, emergency housing isn't being relocated, and they're starting to cut funding for roads, which means soon you won't even be able to travel properly across Russia. As Putin said, why do you need cars? You don't have any roads. Well, he was right about that.
At least he told some truth.
Yeah, so that's the picture. In other words, Russia is actually destroying its own future, and in that future, there's only despair and poverty for Russia. Especially since, I repeat, Russia's main breadwinner, the oil industry, is in trouble, and it's not going to recover. Let me explain why. Russia potentially has a lot of oil and gas, but that's only potential. So it's like the wealth is in the ground, but they're located in places where extraction is extremely expensive. If you're extracting gas, say somewhere around the Yamal Peninsula, you still have to somehow transport it somewhere afterwards. As long as there were pipelines, there was at least some kind of idea. You pumped it into the pipeline and it went on to Europe. And now, when all of that isn't working, the question arises, well, let's say I build an LNG plant on Yamal, but how am I going to transport the LNG from there? There were some absolutely fantastic projects. People in Russia have an astonishing imagination, especially when there's hope of siphoning off budget money. They come up with such projects. There was this marvelous tallow project. You're going to get a kick out of this. The idea was to organize the production of nuclear submarines to transport liquefied gas under the ice of the Northern Sea route. And what a beautiful budget that would be. Yeah, it's quite a marvel, but what can you do? So that's why in Russia, unfortunately, there is very little left for Russians themselves. There's hardly any oil left. There's a lot of gas, but as for the gas, no one wants to take it. So what do you do with it? As you can see, even China is not agreeing to a second pipeline. They can't manage to persuade them about Power of Siberia 2. And as for oil, according to estimates, at today's price levels, there's enough for about 28 years. Oil for...
Wait, did you say 28 years?
Yes.
How many years until 2042?
17. 17. Yes. So basically, to put it simply, the situation is this. The current generation of Russians might end up living in a country that can't export oil. It won't have any oil left for export. Maybe they'll still extract some for their own needs, but overall there won't be anything left for export. You see, I'm talking about things that people find unbelievable, but economics is a harsh thing. It's a tough business. If you're extracting oil at a loss, then why are you doing it? Or is someone supposed to cover your losses? But it's just not realistic to compensate for the losses of the oil industry. Although that's already starting to happen, just pay attention. I never make things up. I get that people think I'm inventing some kind of horror stories. But notice that about a month and a half ago, I think Putin signed a special decree granting tax breaks, if I'm not mistaken, until May of next year for Rosneft and Gazprom. In other words, the companies that are supposed to be feeding the budget with money are being given tax breaks so they pay less, because otherwise they would collapse and stop operating. These are Rosneft and Gazprom, the two largest state-owned companies in Russia, the two main breadwinners. Gazprom, once Russia's national treasure. Let me remind you, what is its current state? A loss-making company. Rosneft is in a very bad financial situation. To keep them from dying, they are given subsidies and tax breaks. So where will the money come from then? Well, they've raised VAT, they'll take it from the population, but